Everybody knows that China is destined to replace the United States as the world's #1 economy. This idea has gone from a sneaking suspicion in the 1990s to an article of faith in the 2020s. China's rampaging economic growth has made this inevitable. The country's recent turn towards wolf warrior diplomacy and the bullying of smaller countries on the world stage provides a worrying preview of the future. The problem with that standard story of inevitable Chinese dominance is that it is no longer true. It relies on a mental model of Chinese economic growth that no longer exists. China is still very likely to surpass the United States eventually, but the era of miraculous Chinese growth is over, and it has been for half a decade. Deng Xiaoping is the man most responsible for China's rise out of poverty. The Communist Party's initial period in power under Chairman Mao saw China unify and forcefully assert its independence. But that's about all you can say in its favor. Mao's Stalinist policies in agriculture and industry killed tens of millions and failed miserably at making the country richer. And that's before Mao got old and went nuts. After drawing the country through one final trauma with the Cultural Revolution, Mao finally died in 1976. Though Deng Xiaoping had fallen from grace during Mao's long decline, he managed to scramble his way to the prime position by 1978, where he made some very important decisions. Deng opened the Chinese economy up to the world, first in special economic zones and then more broadly. While he held on to power behind the scenes until his death in 1997, he set up a system where no one man could consolidate power after him. Deng famously used an old folk expression to describe his policies: crossing the river by feeling the stones. The idea was to clear out the mania of one-man rule, de-emphasize ideological claptrap, and simply focus on what worked. Deng's approach was spectacularly successful. According to the World Bank, 88% of the Chinese population lived in extreme poverty in 1981. The World Bank put that figure at 1.9% in 2014, and today it's basically zero. Mao's time in power saw the Chinese economy fall from the 6th largest in the world to the 10th. Under Deng's reforms, China went from number 10 to number 2, with a GDP 3 times the size of Japan's, the next country in line. Manufacturing replaced subsistence farming, and some of the world's largest cities blossomed out of empty fields. China went from a pariah state to one of the most admired in the world. Through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the steady drumbeat of GDP growth continued. It would rise and fall with the world economy, but it averaged 10% a year for decades, until the U.S. housing market intervened. The 2008 financial crisis didn't end the Chinese growth miracle immediately, but it definitely ended it. The Chinese Communist Party knows that its legitimacy comes from economic growth. So when the world economy crashed in 2008, it had a problem. Unlike the European banks, China hadn't gotten too caught up in U.S. real estate, but being an export-driven economy in a worldwide recession is no fun. China's answer was economic stimulus, massive stimulus, maybe the biggest the world had seen before 2020. And the Chinese paid for all this with debt. It was a more complicated sort of debt than in the US and Europe. In the West, economic stimulus is paid for with government debt or through some central bank chicanery. But in China, the state doesn't just own the central banks, it owns most of the other banks too. In the US, the Bush and Obama administrations had to jump through hoops and essentially bribe banks to lend more money. The Chinese government could simply order that local governments, banks, and other businesses loan and spend more money, and that's exactly what they did in 2008. And it worked! For a little while. China rapidly built up high-speed rail, a rural health system, and hundreds of other projects. They did so much that they ran out of mega projects to build and had to go looking in other countries. Much of this investment was useful, but a lot of it wasn't, and it burdened every actor in the Chinese system with massive debt that began to weigh on the economy. GDP growth was great for a year or two, but then it began to stagnate. And the debt from 2008 ties China's hands. Its 2020 coronavirus stimulus was nowhere near as large. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, his priority was digging China out of this hole. But his attempts to rebalance the economy and launch more consumption-based growth keep falling flat. Liberalizing investment rules in 2015 led to a bubble and a crash the Shanghai stock market still hasn't recovered from 7 years later. Arguably, the United States and Europe haven't recovered from this either. The Chinese crash in 2015 made the world's recovery from the 2008 financial crisis, which was already pretty miserable, just a little bit worse. And just bad enough to give us both Brexit and Trump in 2016. Over the past year, we have seen China's massive real estate industry shake under Xi's mandates that it become less speculative and less debt-ridden. The attempt to make the real estate market more sane has to be balanced against the fact that tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of Chinese now have their life savings locked into real estate prices inflated by unsustainable debt. More and more of China's economy seems to be limited by these sorts of damned if you do, damned if you don't choices. And growth keeps stagnating. A lot of this is just normal developed economy stuff, but China's authoritarian government has been reacting very poorly to the end of easy growth. Xi Jinping, despite, or perhaps because of his failure to resolve any of these economic issues, has been able to amass more power than anyone since Deng Xiaoping. Deng's orderly system of 10-year terms for Chinese leaders has now been dispensed with, and a new personality cult has been built around Xi Jinping. This consolidation is certainly scary from the outside, but if I were Chinese, I would be terrified. Now that the going has gotten a little tougher, the Chinese Communist Party seems to be reverting to an older and dumber form out of fear. Ideological nonsense is back. The leader's personality cult is back. Communist dogma is reasserting itself over Deng's pragmatism. I wouldn't like the argument, but you could make the argument that Mao's brutal one-man rule was necessary for a poor agrarian country to assert its independence on a hostile world stage. You will never be able to convince me that Xi Jinping's neo-Maoist strongman shtick is going to do a good job running the world's second biggest economy, let alone the largest. He already has a record, and it's not good. China's economy remains massive, and its growth is still impressive. But if it's going to overtake the United States, what matters is how Chinese GDP growth stacks up against US GDP growth. In the Deng era, China regularly outpaced the US by 5 to 10% every year. In the Xi Jinping era, the Chinese economy looks more and more normal. China isn't outpacing the United States by all that much anymore. 2021, with its recovery from the COVID shock, saw the largest growth of the Xi Jinping era at about 8%. But in 2022, Chinese economic growth is expected to barely break 5%, just a percent or two ahead of the United States. The projected year when China's economy surpasses the US keeps fading further into the future. It was supposed to be the mid-2020s, now it looks like the early 2030s. Even the purchasing power parity calculation that has China already ahead could slip as China's working age population falls and labor costs go up. I still think the Chinese economy will eventually surpass the United States in size, but I'm less and less confident that it can do so under its current system of government. The Chinese growth miracle is over, for now. The 2020s will see both of the world's two biggest economies reformat their economies from models that haven't been working. During COVID, the US experienced extraordinary economic success simply by giving money to poor people who spend money rather than rich people who use it to inflate the prices of assets they already own. I don't know if it'll be the Republicans or the Democrats who eventually have the balls to do it, but by the end of the decade, I believe the institutionalization of minor redistribution could send US economic growth rates back into the 4 to 6% range, up from the 1.5 to 2.5% range of the Reagan era. This isn't guaranteed, of course, but it is a plausible path to renewed growth. I don't see that path for China right now, and I don't think anybody in the Chinese Communist Party does either. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments.